All right, here you go. Okay, good morning, folks. 9:30 a.m. Pacific time, so probably earlier in the day for some of you, and those of you that are joining in from the East Coast, it might be your lunchtime. Be comfy. We're going to be here together for the next hour together, and hopefully you are all here for the webinar on diversity, equity, inclusion, values in action. For those of you who've joined us before, hi, I'm Aparna, and you know how we typically do the session. We typically have a short teaching section where we want to walk you through a little bit of data or other key predictors of DE&I, and then we want you to learn from like a real person in the real world who's doing this work in all kinds of different ways. And so I'm super excited today to welcome Dr. Julie Pham, and she is gonna chat with us about what respect looks like, not just at work, but also in our personal lives. But since we spend so much time at work, I think it's really relevant to have some really good language to understand how that happens. All right, I'm gonna get started. Thank you everybody for popping into the chat. Love the diversity of people who are here today. Folks are here from Iowa, Boston, Texas, San Francisco, so many different places. This is amazing. Okay, so here we go. All right. Awesome. Hopefully this is what you are here for. I like doing my little pilot check, right? Like this flight is leaving and this is where we're headed. Okay. Who we are, I already said hello. I'm Aparna. I'm the founder of Moving Beyond, a little shop that does data-informed DE&I work. And my colleague, Julian, we say hi. And then, of course, Dr. Julie Pham, she's here with us as well. Here's kind of the roadmap for our time together today. We're going to look at a couple of key predictors of DE&I, specifically the ones that relate to people's attitudes, values, and beliefs, right? And I'll tell you in a second why it's so important to get a sense of where people are in your organization today, right? Who they are, what they value, because that's pretty critical to standing up programs that are going to be successful and also sustainable. And the last 40 minutes of our time together is going to be a conversation where you get to hear from Julie herself. So when we think about DE&I, I think a lot of times organizations are measuring things like fairness or belonging, or they're asking people, hey, do you believe in our leaders, or do we have a DE&I statement? And I think those are all really good things as well. That said, what we know from working in organizations is that if people don't have the right mindsets, the programs are not going to be successful. If you have a big chunk of your workforce that thinks of DE&I as a distraction or a burden or a chore, it's going to be really hard to stand up programs. And so I want to walk you through 3 predictors this morning. And the first one is just, what are people's attitudes towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Do folks in your organization see doing equity and inclusion work as critical, like mission critical to an organization's growth? Or do they see it as a distraction? One of the things that we know is that the vast majority of CEOs see it as a distraction, and if they're a white man, something like 70% of white male CEOs see DEI work as a distraction, whereas roughly 80% of employees kind of across sectors, across company size, see DEI as being mission critical. So important to know where leaders are, where employees are. And then within that, you know, I talk about this all the time. So this is going to be a reminder for folks that are joining us, you know, for the second or third time, which is we need to look at these attitudes, values, and beliefs across the demographic makeup of our organization as well. So we can start to see who really believes in it and who doesn't, so that we can target our efforts where they're going to be the most impactful. And we make a plan to bring people along if we know already that they're simply not bought in. Especially with younger folks. And now that I'm an elder millennial, I'm like, what does it even mean to say younger folks? But if you're a younger millennial, if you're Gen Z, we know that those generations, they want to see not only company statements, but they want to know what it looks like in action. And they're much more likely to apply to your organization. And again, it doesn't matter if you're in nonprofit or philanthropy or corporate or government, they want to know what it looks like, right? So this is one key predictor. If you have the majority of people that believe DEI is important, your likelihood of success kind of goes up, okay? The second key predictor that I want to talk about is growth mindsets. Now, there are lots of researchers that have been studying growth mindsets for a very long time, but generally not in the context of work. So what we know in the context of work is that knowledge and skills are not static. I think we can all agree that we grow on our job, like we grow in our jobs, we learn new things. The things that we were able to do 10 years ago, well, they've shifted wildly, right? Like, so inside of organizations, we want to know, do people believe that knowledge is static, or do people believe that anybody can grow, that anybody can move into sort of a higher order position? And I would say most importantly, are people equally able to fail? In organizations where people are not equally able to fail. And what I mean by that is failure is part and parcel of our work, but sometimes, especially as people of color or minority groups inside of organizations, when we fail, it's seen as a failure of our whole demographic group, right? And that's an organization where growth mindsets aren't particularly high. If I fail and the assumption is, well, South Asian women, they're just not capable, that's showing that your beliefs around skills are static. So we want to build organizations where people can fail without negative consequences, just as often as they're celebrated when they're being successful. And we know that in the context of the workplace, growth mindsets do two big things. One, they retain employees. And if you've ever been a hiring manager, you know how freaking expensive it is to hire people, to go through that process. It's time intensive, it's money intensive, right? And it's hard on people when their colleagues leave, right? So it helps the retention. The second is that organizations where employees have really high growth mindsets, they're likely to be the most innovative players in their fields. So here's kind of what growth mindsets can look like in a snapshot. I want to give you some really concrete examples. My favorite one in the context of DE&I, especially as a brown woman living in the Pacific Northwest that tends to have a really high value on niceness, is one of the last ones, which is, fixed mindset is feedback and criticism are personal. Like, you have injured me by offering me feedback. That's an example of a growth mindset. A fixed mindset. People who have growth mindsets, they're more likely to say, thank you. Yeah, here's an opportunity for me to try doing something differently, right? Another example of a fixed mindset is, I don't like being challenged. And we know that dissent is so important to innovation. It's so important to growth. People that have growth mindsets, they're likely to say, okay, like, I want to know, is there another way of doing this, right? Like, what have I not thought of? And they also are likely in the context of DE&I to recognize, hey, somebody with an identity that's different from mine is seeing the problem in a different way. They have a different orientation to the world, and I'm gonna welcome that. Okay. The last thing that I want to touch on, and this is, in fact, I think this is pretty controversial in America, because America is built on values of like, pull yourself up by your bootstrap, farm this land that you got through the Homestead Act and like make an amazing ranch, or right. There are all of these like notions of Americana, and meritocracy is a pretty big part of the story. And what meritocracy means, like, it's a belief that people are chosen to grow in their careers, or people are successful because of their abilities, because of their hard work, because of the time that they put in. And what we know is that that's simply not true. You can be the hardest worker in your organization and not get promoted. One of the things that I remember from my previous life working in nonprofits in my 20s was in a really large nonprofit organization, was this noticing that just about all senior leaders were white. All of the directors were white, and all of the staff that worked the closest to the community, they were largely people of color. And in that organization, I suspect, right? Like, this is hindsight. Like, I suspect that we would see leaders believing pretty deeply in meritocracy, that you get promoted if you have the right skills based on your merit. And rejecting meritocracy is pretty critical to DE&I being successful, because in order to reject meritocracy, one of the things that you have to know is the road is bumpier for some people more than others, right? That if I live in a really nice part of town, the sidewalk is probably nicer, right? And I can walk a mile in 15 minutes because I'm not stepping over things. They're not potholes. But if I live in a part of town that's not taken care of, right? That's not invested in, it's going to take me longer. It's just going to take me longer, right? And it's in in fact, it's in my best interest to take my time, because that's the safest way to move, by paying attention to what's on the ground. So, brought you a little graphic, two little examples. The first one is, right, this guy's like, hey, this exam, everybody gets to climb the tree, right? And of course the elephant cannot climb the tree. That's not going to happen, right? The fish, no chance, zero chances of climbing this tree. So the bias, right, that only one animal of these 4 or 5 can actually climb a tree, right? Even though it feels like a really fair thing to say, hey, this is an open exam, like anybody can be successful, but no, that's not gonna be the case. I'm gonna stop talking at you in just one quick second. So as many of you are starting to either think about making deeper investments in DE&I or just build better DE&I programs, it's really important to start with measuring where people are today, so that you're not throwing a bunch of spaghetti on the wall and kind of going in blind, that you have a sense of who your people are, what they believe in, how they think. Because any of these things, right, like whether it's growth mindsets or meritocracy, they're all pieces that we can move. They're not, those beliefs themselves are not static, right? So there are really cool ways in which we can cultivate growth mindsets in our organization, very cool ways in which we can help people understand meritocracy in our organization as well.
It is.
All right. So if whether you're starting this work out or you've been at it for a minute, highly recommend Survey your employees, ask good questions. Where are people today? And like, remember to test things in small groups first before scaling it to the rest of the organization. So with that said, if you have any questions, right, let me know in the chat. You can private message me. I'm gonna, of course, send this deck out after the session. And I'm gonna now pass the mic to Julian and Julie. All right. Take it away, folks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited today to be speaking with Dr. Julie Pham, the founder of Curiosity Base. Before we dive into the section, I just want to say, thinking through some of the concepts we previously talked about in regard to our attitudes, beliefs, and values, and how they influence our relationships and the perception of our workplace, I believe it's really important as we think about the 7 forms of respect to really reflect on how our agreed upon culture or climate within our organization contributes to our sense of belonging as we talk through this session. So just keep those in mind for your own personal experiences at work. So with that being said, I guess we'll just go ahead and dive into the questions. First thing I want to ask, because I know you, Aparna knows you, what inspired you to create Curiosity Base, and who's on the team?
Thank you, Julian. By the way, I'm just super excited to be here this morning. And I just want to say I took an early version of the climate assessment. It was really good, provoked really interesting conversations on my team. So Curiosity Base, I started this company last January after leaving the best job I ever had. I'd been there for 6 years at as a nonprofit representing the tech industry in Washington. And I'll say the driving reason, I like to ask this question of what does success look like? And then what does it feel like? And to me, success looks like, and actually I'll talk about because a lot of times people don't ask the question of what does success feel like? And I realized that it feels like freedom. And you know, when we ask the question, what does success look like? Then we follow up, what do you need to do to get there? When I ask the question, what does success feel like? The question I like to follow up with is, what do you need to stop doing? What's preventing you from feeling that? So I wanted to feel freedom. And the thing that was stopping me was, the thing I need to stop was asking permission. I had to stop being in this position where I was going to ask permission from others. So that's, I'll just say that was the reason why I wanted to start my own company. And then there was also, I was in the space where we were talking a lot about increasing diversity, particularly diversity in leadership, particularly diversity in tech. And I realized that a lot of those conversations were about representation. They're about how do we recruit more people of color? How do we recruit more women to roles? And the analogy I like to use is when we're talking about representation, think about it's like a play. You're changing the actors. And yet most management and leadership books are still written by white men. So the scripts are still the same. And so what I wanted to do was also, how do I advocate and celebrate and also contribute to more leadership texts written not by white men? So that was one of the reasons why I want to start the company. And also just seeing that in my years of community building work, and I'll get into this when I talk about what the research is based on, I realized that the thing that was a condition for, we talk about wanting resourcefulness and creativity and innovation in the workplace. And I realized that that curiosity is a condition of that. You need to have curiosity to be able to have that. And so that's what drove me to start my company, because I want to do this with not just with the tech industry and people on my team. We are a team of 5 people, me and one other full-time employee, and then the others are part-time. It's a really diverse group where on the team, Vietnamese, Burmese, Mandarin, Korean, and Spanish are, and all women of color. So And actually, interestingly enough, trained 3 out of 5 trained in social work. I'm trained as a historian and someone else is trained in business management. Yeah.
Okay, that's actually really cool. I love how the idea of curiosity fueled into the name as a base, and also the idea of freedom when it comes to success. I guess the next thing I want to ask is, how did the idea of the 7 forms of respect come about, and why only 7?
Okay, so I'm a big fan of the 5 love languages.
Mm-hmm. Oh, me too.
So I'm seeing some nods, right? I'm a big fan of the 5 love languages, and they have their book, Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace. And I was just like, it doesn't quite work in the workplace. And also just, I've been doing community building work for over 15 years. And what I'd see is just friction pop up between people. And it really just had to do with expectations around what we, around how we want to be treated. And I remember seeing, there was an engineer and a labor organizer. And the engineer just kept asking these really deep probing questions. And the labor organizer's like, why are you asking me these questions? Don't you trust me? I got this. And they were just kind of like going back and forth. And it kind of just hit me like, oh, they're just having a different expectation here of how to treat one another. And so that's, and so then I started asking this question of, well, how do you want to be treated at work? And then the word that kept coming up was respect. And so that's how I moved into, oh, well, let's look into respect. And then you ask the question, why 7? And so when I started doing the research, I thought it maybe was 6. And so we kind of had this, we put out, okay, I think it's 6. And then we just started doing more research and asking questions and seeing how people would talk about things. Mm-hmm. And that's when we were like, it's 7. And they're different from the original 6 that we thought too. So.
Okay. So what are the 7? I know there's consideration.
Yeah, I have an acronym. Otherwise, it's just too hard to remember. So, and the acronym is PICA. So PICA. So it's procedure, punctuality, information, candor, consideration, acknowledgement, and attention. So those are the 7. And I don't know if you want me to go into them or just, I mean, people can, that could take up a lot of time too. Yeah. So, but those are the 7. Okay.
Thank you. I really like that example you had brought up as far as like people from 2 different work environments clashing in their forms of respect. It kind of reminded me of what Aparna was talking about in terms of like moving to the Pacific Northwest and the different work culture around like being blunt versus like that passive aggressiveness or that niceness. So how can we apply some of the practices of the 7 forms of respect to our personal lives?
So, so it's interesting that you asked that, because when, so in the research, we started asking in the workplace, and then in our focus groups and workshops, people were like, this relates to my personal life. Like I've been in follow-up interviews like, oh yeah, I use this with my spouse. And I think that the way that we think about respect is you can use actually the same forms, mm-hmm. and also recognize that they're going to be different. They could be different, because some people say like, I'm the same person at work as I am at home and I am in the community. And the way I treat people is exactly like, I am the same. Mm-hmm. And then other people are like, no, I do not. I am not. Like, I'll do different things with people who are really close to me in my family versus those who are in the workplace. And a lot of that actually has to do with our position at work and expectations. And so it's actually interesting when I hear sometimes people say, I want to bring my authentic self to work. And it's like, what does that mean? Because does that mean that you do exactly the same thing that you do at home? Because probably not. But probably the way that you talk to your kids or your siblings. I mean, I can say I talk really differently to my brothers than I do to my friends. Then it's going to be different than your coworkers, right? So, so in terms of the question of how to apply it at home is to recognize, okay, is there a difference or not? So I'll give an example. consideration is a form of respect that it's about anticipating what people want and need and then interacting with them based on that.
Mhm.
And so what that looks like is at work, what this looks like is, they're so overwhelmed. I'm not going to ask them to join this project. They keep talking about how overwhelmed they are. They are not going to want to join that. And then you think about the receiver. Some people might be, oh, well, I want to be asked no matter what. And another person might be, I'm so glad they didn't ask because I'm so overwhelmed, right?
Mhm.
And so actually at work, I'm all about lack of consideration. This is not one of my forms of respect. Oh, and I want to point out right now, a big misconception about the 7 forms is sometimes people think you have to be respectful in all these 7 ways. And that is not the case. It's actually about figuring out what are your preferences? What do you actually care about? What matters to you, and what matters to you so much that you will do it no matter what, even if you know it doesn't matter to other people.
Mm.
And then I will tell you, though, in my personal life, I tend to have a lot more consideration. Like, oh, this person is going through a tough time.
Mm.
I should reach out, or no, I'm not going to, because I don't want to. I mean, I'm that person who, when my friends have new parents, I'm that person who like doesn't invite them to the party because they're like, oh, they're going to be too busy. So, so there can be this difference in our personal life, in our work life.
Okay.
And I actually want to point out one other thing. A helpful way to think about this is when we're asking people about respect, they would bring up the golden rule: treat people the way that you want to be treated. So that's the golden rule. And then, but the thing is, what if someone doesn't want to be treated the way you want to be treated? And then there's the platinum rule, which is treat people the way they want to be treated. Now, what if someone doesn't tell you how they want to be treated? What often happens is you might mirror back. You think like they did this to me, so they must want me to do it to them. But actually think about that person who gives you all this unsolicited constructive feedback. And when you do it to them, they don't like it. When you give them unsolicited constructive feedback, they don't like it. So the platinum rule isn't always right either. And so I have what I call, I like to think of it as like the rubber band rule.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea here is that respect is actually flexible. We are elastic. We stretch. We actually stretch kind of intuitively, depending on who we're interacting with, depending on if they have more power, less power, or equal power to us than in the workplace, depending on if it's us giving, showing the respect, or our expectations of getting it. And so we actually intuitively flex. The thing, though, is that often at work, we might be doing things that we don't like to do, mm-hmm. because we know that another person thinks it's respectful. But if we do something that makes us really uncomfortable over time, then what will happen is we will snap. And we don't even know what's happening. And instead, what we say is like, it's a toxic workplace. Instead, it's a workplace that had some expectations that were never talked about, right? Like people didn't talk about what is our culture here, what are our expectations of how to behave, mm-hmm. and then someone snaps. So I think what's really important is to understand our breaking point.
Okay, I got a lot there, especially that end part about like understanding and establishing a common culture. I remember I'm currently a doctoral student, as you know, and we talk about that concept around like group norms, mm-hmm. and establishing those in order for like more cohesiveness and collaboration on a team. And honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like I've been thinking of the 7 forms of respect more one-dimensionally, like in one-on-one relationships. So how does respect show up within organizations outside of one-on-one relationships?
Yes, that's a great question. So I think of it as there's the individual, right? Mm-hmm. There's the team, and then there's the organization. And so there's me, Julian, there's me and you. It's like, this is what I Julie, like this. Julian, you like some things, you don't like some things. We are having this interpersonal relationship. Maybe I'll learn what your forms of respect are and ask you why, right? And so they'll be mindful of that. And then there's what the team's preferred forms of respect are. And then there's what the organization's forms of respect are. Because I mean, I think when people talk about culture, they often conflate it with mission and values. And it's like what you should do versus what you do. And employees do what the leaders do. They don't do what the leaders say, they do what the leaders do. And so oftentimes it's the leader, it's the team leader or the organizational leader that's kind of setting what the forms of respect are. So for example, if it is really important to a team leader that meetings start on time, then other people quickly pick up, I better be on time, right? Like I better be on time. And you can also say as a norm, like we are on time. And yet if the team leader is constantly late, that's just like a norm on paper then. Mm-hmm. Right. So so people are actually constantly trying to pick up what people do. So in any case, there are these different levels. And I think of it as at the organizational level, that's the national language. The preferred forms of respect are the national language. So when I was at a very large local tech company here in Seattle, I would say that candor and information and acknowledgement were forms of respect there. And what they did not care about was attention. There was multitasking all the time. And so that's the national language. And then you think about individual departments or teams, like there's the marketing team, the finance team, the engineering team, and they will have their own forms of respect too. And then there's the individual within that. So there's actually like, we're constantly switching. We're constantly navigating. And actually, I think going back to what Aparna was talking about for the growth mindset, I think the growth mindset has a lot to do with just being adaptive. And so those are people who are going to be really successful in an organization are those who actually can speak to finance and can speak to marketing and can speak to engineering and also speak to the executive team, and that they understand that there are different forms of respect that are being practiced and exercised. I will say there's the state, the existing forms, and then what I try to push teams to do when I work with them is, okay, this is what you have. Is this actually what you should have that supports your shared work? And that is actually a really helpful question to depersonalize things, because otherwise it's Aparna's the boss. Aparna, like people see what Aparna likes. But then if there was a question of like, well, what is moving beyond? What's our shared work? What's our mission? And what forms of respect do we need actually are mission critical to supporting that versus the ones that are just going to be less priority. Because if we try to do all 7, we're going to be exhausted. If we try to be perfect and try to be respectful in all these different ways, and also you find out actually some of them don't matter as much to your team. So. Okay.
So it's really multifaceted, especially when we think about like power dynamics within an organization, understanding how the different forms of respect show up in your organization within its overall climate helps like kind of alleviate some of those tensions. Okay.
Well, and I think that, I really think of the forms of respect as, so another misconception is that it works like communication styles or personality tests where, Myers-Briggs, I'm an ENTJ, and I've seen, and some organizations use Enneagram and they go around and they're like, I'm a 9, I'm a 3, I'm a, I'm a this, I'm a that, I'm a driver, I'm a harmonizer. Yeah. And so forms of respect doesn't categorize people that way. So it's actually more of a conversation tool. So it's like, hey, this is actually my preference generally, and this is why. And so, for example, punctuality is really important to me because I grew up with, my mom was constantly late picking me up from school. And I was just like, I was embarrassed because the school staff would have to wait with me. And I was just, well, when I grew up, I'm not going to do that. And so someone else could have the exact same experience and be like, what's the problem? Not a big deal. My mom was late, right? Yeah. But Julian, you're going to remember my story, right? Much more than you're going to remember Julie's forms of respect are this, this, and this. It's actually a tool to spark conversations, because what we really need to be asking is, why do you care about that?
Mm.
And that's where we get into this like, how do we use it to spark conversations, to build this sense of belonging, which I think is rooted actually I think belonging inclusion is rooted in curiosity. It's being able to ask questions, feeling safe. I really think that is an indicator of psychological safety.
Thank you. On that piece of, like, you brought up your past and how it kind of informed how you show your respect and how you expect to be respected. When we are diversifying teams, whether it's small business or larger organization, when there's so many people from different backgrounds and with different attitudes and values, sometimes tensions can arise because of those varying interpretations of respect that are informed by their past. So I guess what I want to ask is, how do team members handle preferred workflows that may clash when another employee's preferred form of respect is different from their own?
Yeah, I think that goes back to, hey, what are we doing together? What's our work together? Because I mean, at work, you are there to work. So you are there's either a service, or I mean, we're serving our clients, right? And so what is that that shared work? And then you think about, well, what do we need to do? And that way, again, it kind of depersonalizes it versus like, well, this person likes this and this person likes this. It's not a democracy. It's not about voting, right? I mean, if you do have enough people who are like, I know we need to do this thing, but I like, majority of people on the team don't like candor, for example, then okay, let's talk about that. And then maybe we don't need to have candor, even though we thought we needed it for the work. I think it's just more about, having conversations. So for example, if you think about an emergency room, they do not care about clock time. It is not about punctuality. It's not about the first person came to their appointment and that person's going to be served. It's who needs help the most, right? So time is much more fluid in that environment, right? I mean, I know on my team, because we are such a small team, because we are a startup, candor is actually really important because we're pretty flat. Actually, even though I'm the head, we're actually pretty flat. So candor is super important to the nature of our work, because we are building the plane as we fly it. So it's just like, okay, well, this is what we need to do. So it's really just having, and then I have ways of kind of stress testing that, like, do you really need this? Because what will happen if you don't have it? Because otherwise people kind of get into like, well, we need this and we need this. So for example, information is one where it's giving access to data, to this could look like seeing a lot of people on emails. This could be like everyone's invited to the meetings, right? And then it's just like, well, what happens if because in principle, you're like, oh, information sounds great. We should do that. I'm actually like an information on need to know basis. So that's just me, right?
Yeah.
But other people are like open culture because it saves time, because then it's all accessible, right? And so but then you have to ask, if we don't do that, what are the consequences? Ooh, we've seen the consequences are bad. We better do that. Or like, you know what? It's actually like what we've seen is like reduced stress, because people don't feel like they constantly have to read all this, digest all this information. So it's really kind of then diving in and going like, what does this look like at our organization?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. One of my forms of respect, even thinking through it, is like, I'm the information sharer. Like, I will overshare every single detail that someone could potentially need. And I'm like, wait, this is taking up way too much time. And now we're pushing on the deliverable. So that's actually really helpful information for me personally.
Yeah, and then another example, because information is also information. I'll say information and candor are a bit different in that, like, candor is about, because sometimes people ask me what's the difference. Candor is information that's given to improve something. Like there's an expectation of an action coming from it, where information is just for the sake of information. So even like information about at the workplace, like information about, I just want to share about my life, right? And so some people are like, oh, I hate that. I'll do it on the team because I have to, because that seems to be like the expectation. I don't want to, I don't want to hear everyone's life. I don't want to like talk about mine, you know, and yet other people feel like some other teams are just, no, we need to do this to be close. So.
Okay. Well, I guess going on the same thread, when new people are being onboarded into organizations, some managers and employees may share preferred forms of respect from the get-go, especially when we think about like having common identities with each other and similar backgrounds. One thing I want to ask are, what are some ways managers can hold space for different employee perceptions of being respected on their team, without it influencing their evaluations of employee performance?
Yeah, I think it's getting to that, allowing for time for people to explain why they care about what they care about, why they do what they do. So, so there are kind of two parts. There's like the onboarding, and then to your question, like there's the onboarding, and then there's the how do you make sure that employees don't get penalized, right? And so I think for the onboarding, this can actually even happen at the recruitment stage, is when someone is interviewing, they're like, what is this? What's it like to be on this team? It's like, oh, well, we're really fast paced. And well, does that mean that you multitask all the time? Because I'm going to feel really disrespected if I'm talking and people are on their computers. And yet at other places, it's like not a big deal. It's totally, actually, some people have told me multitasking is a sign of performance. So, you know, and so that's, so, but wouldn't you want to know that going in? Wouldn't you want to know how people are going to behave on the team? Right. And so that's one thing, is just to be like, this is actually these are the forms of respect that we think are, that we practice, and that the ones that we don't prioritize. These are the ones you prioritize and don't prioritize. And then it feels just less personal. Right. And then in terms of how do you make sure that people don't get penalized? I'm going to take a step back and think about this, the word intentions. So the thing is about intentions is usually we have either they're good intentions or they're bad intentions. And so, and like that, and if they're good or bad is usually assigned to if I like you or not. They're good if I like you, they're bad if I don't like you. So, right. But either way, people don't actually ask, well, what were your intentions? Like, what's your thinking behind that? And so even to just get into the practice of like, hey, I noticed you do that. Can you tell me more? Like, or just tell me who influenced how you think about respect. And when I ask that question, a lot of times people they've never even asked that question for themselves. They don't know. I mean, so, just for those in the audience right now, even think about that. Who influenced your forms of respect? Your role models, your first boss, your parents, your family members. Who did that for you? What do you think of as is acceptable and not acceptable? Because what's happening is you go into the world thinking this is the norm. And so making space for those conversations about, no, this is not, I have a different expectation and this is why. One of the most interesting explanations I heard, we have procedure, which is following directions and established norms. And so, and having really wanting clear expectations too. And so one person shared that she really clear expectations and rules are really important to her and detailed. And she realized that her coworkers thought she was being micromanaging or just like a little too rigid. And stepping back, she realized, she grew up translating for her parents who spoke limited English. So she had to be super clear, super detailed about explaining things. And that was her reason why. And so once you hear that story, it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's why. And so actually, I think it helps when we're asking each other, because oftentimes we haven't even asked ourselves these questions. And I will say, like, just like a theme throughout my work in some forms of respect and just curiosity work is all of my work is actually about, it starts from the individual. And so it starts with increasing self-awareness and then building relationships across difference and communicating clearly. So if we think about that through a curiosity lens, it's about getting curious about yourself and then getting curious about other people and letting other people get curious about you. That is key. That is reciprocity. It's not just I'm being curious about you, Julian. I have to share myself, right? That's how we have a relationship. And then it's asking questions and listening with curiosity. So it's really the conversation. That's how we make a space. That's how employers, to your question, how do people not get penalized? I think it starts with the understanding, and then also having a discussion of like, okay, I know that's what your personal preferences are, and this is what we need to do together for us to be able to do this work that we're committed to doing. I think a lot of times people just want to understand why.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Even thinking through what you just said about like having a conversation of like what informs our way of respect and why we do what we do for particular tasks on the team, it already reminds me of like the concept of when diverse employees or applicants are advocating for change within an organization. And sometimes there's that tension for managers of like, okay, how do I hold space for this? Or what? I don't understand this from my personal background. Like even initiating that conversation or doing their own research to figure out where that's coming from can help bridge that gap and also push attitudes more positively towards DE&I. So thank you for that. One thing I definitely did want to ask you with our workplaces constantly shifting, as we know, becoming more heterogeneous over time. There have been at times a sense of a lack of belonging, like you had touched on, with differing values within versus majority and minorities, say like people of color in tech, and so on. So one thing I wanted to ask you is, since we're starting at the base, how do we go about initiating those conversations so we can get to that sense of belonging and cohesiveness on a team?
Yes, and I'm going to share briefly about one of the things that informed this book is actually because I've lived in different countries and I've been this American in the UK and in Vietnam and Germany and France. It's like, oh, they do things differently here, right? And so just being in the newcomer in that way, and so a lot of this some forms of respect is also, it's designed for people to, hey, I'm new to this. I'm new to this workplace, and how do I understand this culture? And then also, how do other people understand me? And I mean, I think this is more important than ever because our workplace really is diversifying, and there's just like this whole mix of people coming in. And so I think it's setting aside time to ask a series of small questions. So, I mean, actually, Aparna, I mean, you asked this, you brought up, was like office housework and what does that have to do with respect? And I actually, from that, I included a section in my book, actually, about how you can have a conversation that breaks it down. So, because one way it's like, hey, dude, you're asking all the women to like go organize the holiday party and pick the furniture, right? So or you can say, hey, I noticed that you asked the CFO and the IT manager to do this work. Why is that? Oh, I don't know. Well, did you, I'm pointing this out because, I mean, they're the only two women on the team. And so we've talked about just making sure that people have really clear roles and responsibilities, and just like, I wonder how that's going to be perceived. And then the person looking back and saying, perhaps it's, for example, oh gosh, I realized that when I grew up, the women in my family seemed to like all of that work, or do that work, I should say. They did the work, right? And that and how much of me asking is actually rooted in my upbringing. And then like the other person can say, well, this is my upbringing, or this is my expectation, this is my experience. And to kind of have a conversation about that, to then get to a place versus don't do it. Because like when you say something like don't do this or you're doing something bad, I think that it's just people are gonna, they will automatically feel defensive.
So kind of around when having those courageous conversations, we're thinking of like intention versus impact.
Mm-hmm.
So
and wanting to understand the intention.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes I think we don't ask a question because we assume, oh, they have good intent, so I'm not going to ask. Mm-hmm. So I think that the thing is just to ask in general.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. I do want to give some time for questions from the audience, just in case. I do have a few more questions of my own personally, but I'm not gonna hog all the space. I can always email you. So if anyone wanted to pop a question in the chat, or you can go ahead and unmute as well to ask a question for Dr. Pham, please go ahead. Oh, Amanda, are you asking a question? I can't tell. I don't know if it's frozen or not. Well, while people's gears are turning, I'm going to go ahead and pitch another question. So what should applicants or employees do when they notice a misalignment of respect within the culture of a workplace while they're applying, or like maybe they're like job shadowing? What should they do?
Do you mean, do you mean, oh, I don't think that this is going to align with what I personally care about? Or do you mean, I mean, so then you could ask them, and I actually think that when you are interviewing, you should ask some questions, because and ask like why, and kind of depending on if they get reactive, that might not be a good place of if they're defensive in the interview. So that's just a side note, just like an interview tip. But I mean, I think just asking, hey, why do we do that? Why is that done here? Because there could be some reason for it that people just don't understand, that you don't understand. So I think it just goes back to ask. So I noticed that people are doing a lot of, I mean, I guess like there's a lot of people on their screens right now. Is that normal? And then having the person say like, yeah, we do that all the time. Like, why? It's like, because we've got so many meetings and it's okay. Like, it's fine. We can hear and do.
Okay.
And then you have to decide, actually, is that going to work for you?
Thank you again. I want to check one more time. Does anyone have any questions? No pressure as well. You can always shoot follow-up questions to Dr. Pham. But I just wanted to hold space for that.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Oh, hi. I'm off camera because I'm in my pajamas and I'm homesick. So, and it's being recorded. I guess the question that I get when introducing anything to when working with clients is like the when do we do this? How do we go about, when do we find the time or what have you? So I'm just curious, what your thoughts around that are. And then I'm also like toggling on your website. So I'm like, no, let me stay here. So to look for the answer. But yeah.
So do you mean when to have conversations or when to talk about?
Or just like even like possibility of like introducing, the framework or what have you. Or maybe even the conversations, right? Like especially if if an organization doesn't have that norm of checking in or the power dynamic or all that good stuff.
Yeah. So I know that usually when I work with my clients, it's usually around retreat time. It's like, hey, we're doing our strategic planning. Let's do also, because it's actually really good trust building. So that could be, if you're thinking of like a when as in an event, that could be it. I also think that just setting aside time to have even just like the first 15 minutes of a meeting, just even if you went around and it kind of depends on how big the meeting is, it's just like, hey, where did your ideas of respect come from? And just having everyone go around and just share that, because you will learn about someone's some interesting story just through that. So
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? So I guess, Julie, like I'm wondering how do we bring this up with leaders in an organization? And I ask that because I feel like this like reflective work is very similar to DE&I, where a lot of people that don't have, positional power and authority are doing it. And leaders are maybe not paying attention or not participating. So how do we start having these conversations with leaders and encouraging them to grow in their awareness as well, not just with each other?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I hear from a lot of leaders that their cultures are really suffering, that it's really hard, especially now when we're working remotely. And so to kind of introduce this as a culture assessment conversation, hey, let's just reevaluate how people are interacting with one another, and how are we behaving with one another? Because I've also heard from people that, oh, things have changed now that we're working remotely. There are things that we used to do and things have shifted. And so actually, like, you could even use just the because things have changed, hey, let's have this conversation, because it is really important to have now. We're losing people. It's hard. I mean, the Great Resignation is real. And a lot of times people leave because they don't feel respected. And then you have to evaluate, well, what does that mean? Because we give them this, we give them bonus, we do all these things, and yet they don't feel a sense of belonging. So this is a way to have that conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. One research fact is that compensation actually plays a much smaller role in keeping people happy than we think it is. It's throwing more money at folks doesn't actually change their desire to stay. All right. So all of that said, we're at time. Julie, do you want to tell us about your book launch? And
yes. My book is coming out. So the 7 Forms of Respect book is coming out on Kindle on Tuesday. So I'm asking people to help me get it to bestseller status by getting it on Tuesday. And the paperback is going to come out on May 31st. So yes, and we're going to have a launch party and love to see you there.
Amazing. All right. Be sure to check it out. I was an early reader of Julie's book, and it's been incredible for myself as well in my journey as a leader to really be mindful of how we connect with each other. So thanks for joining us, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay in touch.